Preparing. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's Meet the Author event. We have a special St. Patrick's Day version for you this evening. My name is Tracy McIntyre. I am the lead educator at the museum, and I'm here with my colleague, Melissa Wynn, who is the Director of Communications and Marketing. And we are so pleased this evening to welcome author Damian Shiels, a true Irishman, for our St. Patrick's Day event. And he is a postdoctoral research fellow at Northumbria University. He comes to us tonight from Finland, actually, but we are very grateful to him for taking the time out to come and talk about his book. His book being Green and Blue, The Irish Americans in the Union Military from 1861 to 1865. So Damian, I'm going to turn it over to you. He will give a brief presentation, and then for those of you watching, if you want to put your questions in the comments, he will take questions afterwards. Thank you, Damian. Welcome.
Thanks a million, Tracy, and thanks, Melissa, and thanks to the museum for having me on to chat to you. Because I'm in Finland, St. Patrick's Day is already over here, so I hope you enjoyed the last couple of hours of it in the States. But it's good to be with you. I'm just going to run through a few slides, so I will share my screen and hopefully you will be able to see everything okay. And just give you a kind of a brief overview of some of the topics in the book before we dive into some questions. But you might be wondering, the Irish Americans, and we've all been seeing it. I've certainly been seeing a lot of it today on St. Patrick's Day. You know, you get a lot of posts about of Irish Americans in the Civil War. Why do we need another book on them? I could maybe ask myself this. This is the third time I've written about the Irish and the American Civil War in book format. But I argue that we did need another book. And I want to use the Battle of Gettysburg is a demonstration of why I think we needed some new work on the Irish, specifically in the Union military and the US forces during the war. And I would prompt you to maybe think about what you think about when you're thinking Irish and the American Civil War. What would you have seen a lot of posts today about? You would have seen a lot of posts about these guys, the Irish Brigade. This is the Irish Brigade monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The most famous unit tied to the Irish, one of the most famous units in the entire Civil War, you could argue, right? Incredibly famous. And so most of our attention regarding the Irish gets sucked towards the Irish Brigade. You might, and I'm sure with some of you viewing are very familiar with some of these others, you might think of some of the other ethnic units. This is the 69 Pennsylvania Infantry Monument at the Angle, another ethnic Irish unit out of Philly, really significant. Or you might think about somebody who you want to rub the nose off. Colonel Patrick O'Rourke up on Little Round Top. Irishman, went to West Point, killed with the 140th New York Infantry on Little Round Top. As I always say, as we all remember, the most important action that occurred at Little Round Top on the 2nd of July was the action of the 104th, not some other lads from Maine. I think there's something about them in the film. Anyway, so that's probably what you would think about, is one of those kind of three things. I just want to show you, this is a map I worked on last year to try and give a portrayal of what the actual Irish experience of Gettysburg is. This is a map of monuments relating to units that suffered at least one Irish American fatality. This is not Irish Americans in the unit. It's a fatality at Gettysburg. And you can see how that map of the battlefield is completely explodes. And this isn't a complete map. It's just as far as I've got with it. It's 158 different infantry, cavalry, and artillery units in the service of the United States at Gettysburg suffer an Irish-American fatality. 17 different states and the United States regulars. And you can see New York dominates with Pennsylvania behind it and Massachusetts in third, which is, as I will talk about briefly in a minute, what the proportional 1, 2, 3 of Irish American service in the US military is. But we don't really know about all these guys who are outside the Irish Brigade. There's plenty even in the Green Flag ethnic units that we don't know a lot about, but nearly all our attention is focused on those men. And one of the things I wanted to do was to try and write a book that sought to encompass the silent majority, because the most usual Irish American experience of the American Civil War wasn't in the Irish Brigade, it wasn't in the 69 Pennsylvania, it was spread around all these different units. And that's why I wanted to write this book, and to kind of explore that story for the first time. How do you do it though? The reason that these haven't been written a book on this before isn't because historians haven't been bothered about it. There is a problem. We have an ocean of correspondence from the Civil War, but Irish were poor. They tended to be working class, and a lot of them were illiterate. And they did not leave behind a large number of letters, particularly the enlisted men who I'm the most interested in. I'm most interested in the rank and file experience. And so, in an effort to try and find the Irish story, different Civil War historians have used a lot of really excellent techniques to try and get around this, but it always tends to lead back to having to focus on the writings that come out of units like the Irish Brigade. And it's, I argue, quite a different experience, because the Irish Brigade is doing things like having to pump up its ethnicity, because they are the representatives of the Irish in the Civil War. Everybody sees them as that. Other Irish soldiers see them as that. And so they're consistently trumpeting their Irish ethnicity. So how representative are they really? And so I wanted to try and find a way of accessing these men's correspondence. And if you have a kind of handy decade lying around with not much else to do, you too can do this. It didn't take very long. The way I was able to do it was through the widow's pension file system, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail tonight, but there are 1.28 million of these files in the National Archives. About 168,000 of them have been digitized. And in a small percentage of them, widows and mothers handed in original correspondence written by the soldier who had died to prove their entitlement to a pension. And so over the course of a decade, I went through the 168,000 digitized files systematically, trying to identify Irish American troops. Men like this man on the left, Michael Higgins, who was killed at Gettysburg. So in the end, that produced a new corpus of Irish American enlisted men's letters that's just under 1,500 letters, relating to 568 men. So it's the largest single body of writing that we now have on Irish Americans in the American Civil War. They're also the most representative group because they served in 260 different units. They served in every theater of war in which the United States was engaged. 98% of them were enlisted. So it's not just the officers that we're getting, it's mainly enlisted men. And so they are, in their words and in the files that surround them, the way that we can get at the wider experience of the Irish in the US military. This map on the left shows actually where they're from. There's at least one from every county of the 32 on the island of Ireland. Okay, so the book itself really is in two sections. So the latter three chapters are doing, if you like, a Civil War soldier studies. It's the first time we've been able to do a Civil War soldier study examination through correspondence of Irish American servicemen because of these letters. But as well as that, I wanted to set the scene. What was an Irish American? How many of them were in service? Where did they serve? Those type of questions I wanted to try and nail down. And one of the things that you will read if in the book is that there's been a major problem in Civil War histories previously. And I go into detail in the book on this, but suffices to say that the numbers that you will tend to read are wrong in previous Civil War history. You will read that the Irish were underrepresented in the United States military. In fact, the evidence suggests that they were overrepresented in the military. At a minimum, 180,000 Irish-born men served in United States forces during the Civil War. But it's not just the 180,000 Irish-born men. We have to add an additional 70,000 Canadian, British, and American-born children of Irish immigrants, because we know that the Irish were massively ethnically cohesive you'll see two examples from the corpus of letters here of two men, one born in England, one born in America, referring to themselves as Irish. They tended to marry into the Irish ethnic community and they saw themselves as ethnically Irish. So, what you're dealing with then is an Irish American figure in US forces in the American Civil War that you have to tally at around 250,000 men. It's an absolutely immense number. In fact, in Irish history, only the First World War compares with it in terms of the numbers of Irish people who have served in military uniform in modern history. So massively significant. And flips on its head. Previously, we've been trying to explain, well, why were the Irish underrepresented? Now we have to try and seek to explain, why are they overrepresented? Okay, so that's some of the elements I'm trying to explore in the book. But kind of diving into them, and it's St. Patrick's Day today, so I had to have a couple of St. Patrick's Day references in this. Our popular image of Irish American soldiers, your classic Irish Brigade soldier, is a famine immigrant, isn't it? Somebody who kind of had come over relatively recently after 1845 into the 1850s. And most of the Irish-born men were from that period. But there were huge numbers, tens of thousands of them, who had emigrated before the famine. There were men who had been adults when they came to America, but there were men who had been 1 or 2 years old or had grown up in Irish immigrant communities elsewhere. So you have this mass diversity to it. And they weren't all Catholics either. This is another, we often think of them as this, but there were thousands of Presbyterians, from a lot of them from Ulster, also serving, and lots of Protestants as well. And this is one of them, Richard Barrington of the 1st Missouri Engineers, who sent the letter on the right-hand side there 161 years ago today to his wife, where he references St. Paddy's Day, but he had no chance to drown the old toad here, which is drink. I hope that I'll be home the next good old Saints' Day and drink his health a double time along with you and my friends, he said. But unfortunately, he never did get home, and his wife submitted that letter in order to get a pension improver entitlement to it. And that is the kind of the sad story that goes with this correspondence being left to us. But so we have to think about them as this kind of broad church, if you like, in terms of men and their experiences when you're dealing with that many. One of the things we can do as well is we can determine where they served, right? So New York is by far and away the biggest story in relation to this. About 51,000 Irish-born men enlist in volunteer units from New York State, and it's over double the next biggest, which is Pennsylvania. Mainly Philadelphia, but not exclusively. So you have Pittsburgh and places. And that's followed by Massachusetts, etc. But effectively, what you have to think about when you're thinking about the Irish is not ethnic units. It's urban units from largely the East Coast, but anywhere in the North. If an urban regiment has a bad day on an American Civil War battlefield, Irish Americans are dying. Okay? It also tells us where they're serving. So more Irish Americans serve in the Eastern Theater than they do in the West because the concentrations are higher in places like Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, right? And so it's the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James, are where they're really huge numbers of them. We think a lot about the volunteers, but I do want to just have a word for some of the other. And I break down the different units and different kind of branches of service, things like the Navy in the book. But often some of the most Irish units on a battlefield are the United States regulars. You'll read about it in the book as well if you want to, but just the United States, many of you I'm sure are familiar, 2 regular brigades go into the Wheatfield fight at Gettysburg. They suffered a greater real and proportional loss of Irish Americans than the Irish Brigade did in that fight, right? A massive number of Irish. At Antietam, the 4th United States Infantry, 100%, they didn't suffer hugely at Antietam, but 100% of their fatalities at Antietam were Irish American. 63% of the regular division's entire casualties, fatal casualties at Antietam, were Irish American. If you just look at the infantry, actually, it's nearly 75%. It's about 73%. So, you just have to start broadening your horizons to think about the impact that all this is happening. So it's not just the Irish Brigade at the Sunken Lane. It's all these other units all around them. that are being impacted. Okay, so that's kind of one part of the book, is trying to dive into that. The other is then seeking to get at these guys' experiences. And I would imagine it's not much surprise to any of you that they don't differ massively in kind of the standard, what they complain about. They're always moaning about, we don't have enough tobacco. Tobacco is too expensive. They won't let us have drink. It's very boring down here. Why don't you write more? There's a lot of this sort of stuff. So kind of the classic letters that you're getting from soldiers on both sides. But what you do see are a number of marked points of difference that I want to talk to you about. One of them is their religion. So they are overwhelmingly Catholic, these men. But whereas a lot of other groups had ready access to things like chaplains, there were very few Catholic chaplains in the United States military, for example. Only 53 or so are known to have served in the Civil War. And so that was one reason you might join an ethnic regiment, a Green Flag regiment, to get access to a Catholic chaplain. But if you weren't in one of them, what do you do? And what you see in their correspondence is that they actually effectively take steps themselves when that's the case. And the main way they do it is by wearing religious items and carrying their religion with them on their body. These sacramentals, things like scapulars and Agnus Dei, they reference it consistently through their correspondence. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Thomas Monaghan in the 95th Pennsylvania Infantry sends $5 so that masses can be said for him. William Dwyer, who was in the Irish Brigade, was wearing his scapulars at Antietam and Fredericksburg and had to get them replaced because he said they were all wore out and I lost the part that goes down my back. You have men saying that it was what got them through battles and danger. And we know archaeologically, this is on the right, the site at Antietam, where in 1988 they recovered some remains of the Irish Brigade dead, and they had all these religious sacramentals on them. And so this is how they're trying to access their religion to get some comfort when they don't have easy access to priests, for example. So that's one area it was a bit different for them. Another is that they are of white northern ethnic groups, if you like. They are the poorest, they are the most uniformly working class, they are the most uniformly urban of them. And so they are the most economically precarious white group in Northern service. And that makes a big difference because, for example, the US Army consistently failed to pay their men on time. You know, they're supposed to be paid every 3 months. They're always late with pay. It just happens all the time. And this puts enormous pressure economically on Irish Americans. Most Irish Americans that are renting tenement apartments in Philadelphia or Boston or New York, they're vulnerable. Their families are vulnerable. And so you get letters like the letter that this man on the left here, Kieran Phelan, got from his wife when he was at the front. He was in the 11th Connecticut. And his wife Elizabeth wrote to him in early 1864 to say that she'd heard the men all got paid down there, for all the women around here got their money, but she hadn't got anything. Their son Willie was dying of the lung fever, and she had been forced to keep burning their winter fuel through the night, so they were going to run out of fuel. I ain't got as much wood as will do me another week, she said to her husband. How do you suppose that I can get along, or do you care for 3 little children and a woman left to the waves of the world? What I'll do, I don't know, if you don't send me money very soon. So I won't go into it in massive detail here, but I think it's very important. In the past, we've kind of looked at things like maybe the Irish didn't like the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't like Republicans and Abraham Lincoln very much. They're recent immigrants. They're not ideologically invested in the war. When you look at the enlisted men, it is nearly always economics and their immediate family concerns that are driving any decisions they make about whether they would desert or whether they're turning away. It is not these big political decisions. It is letters like this that are determining the decisions they're going to make, right? Practical decisions. And that's really important. One of the other things we see, and this might surprise some, is because of the massive illiteracy rates, around 20% of individuals in the heavily Irish Sixth Ward, New York City in 1855, for example, are illiterate. Um, we see from the widow's pension files that a lot of Irish lie on the census return in 1860 to say that they could read and write when they could not. A lot of them are not able to write letters. And even if they could write letters, a significant number of, say, their parents who they might be writing to can't read or write either. But it doesn't stop them from actually communicating. And it doesn't stop either party, even if those at home can't read and write and the soldier at the front can't read and write, they also give out about the fact, you've forgotten me, you haven't sent me a letter. And that's because they use amanuenses. They use people to write their letters for them. And this is an example of a man, John Brennan from Monasterevin in County Kildare, writing two letters. None of these letters have anything in them to betray the fact that this man isn't writing the letter himself. So you might have letters at home. You might think that they were written by a soldier. They're not necessarily so. You can see when you look at these two letters side by side, they're in different hands. Somebody was writing these letters for them. And usually we find that when they were getting these letters written for them, they often got another ethnic Irishman to do it. So even if they're not in an Irish Brigade unit, even if there's only a handful of them, they are very ethnically cohesive, and they trust other Irish guys with, committing their thoughts to paper. It's a very uneven process if you're relying on someone to write your letters for you. They can mix your messages. They can do whatever they want. So you don't want to be too vulnerable in that. And so they saw comfort in other ethnic Irish soldiers where they could to write them for them. I do want to just talk about that ethnic cohesiveness because it is an enormous factor in it. So most units might have in a company, say 5 or 10 Irish Americans in it, maybe even less. But what you see all the time is that they tend to coalesce. So they will do things like tent with each other, that they will mess with each other. And one of the ways you see this come out is when these soldiers take it upon themselves to write letters back to their comrades' family when they died. And they will express things like, I tented with him. I didn't know him before. We met in the army, but we were like brothers. Okay, and you see an example here of Thomas Doyle, who was killed in the war in the 4th Maine. And he was born in England, but refers to all these other guys as Irish and himself in that vein as well. But he talks about the Irishmen that he was serving with in that way. This is another example of them seeking out their own. And this is an example of one of these death letters that I was talking about from John Meehan to the mother of his comrade, John Gannon, who said that I was to him like a brother and him to me. The fact is, we both slept and ate together since we first enlisted. These men are not in ethnic Irish units. These are spread out. So, but you see it in the Navy, you see it everywhere that they do this. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time they will do it. So very ethnically cohesive within their companies. One of the other things, and I touch on a lot of there's a lot of myths around the Irish about drinking, about them loving the fighting Irish and all that in the book. One of the things that you do see a lot of is prejudice in relation to them. And I wanted to explore that. So, for example, you see some of it can be savage, but the subtle prejudice is by far the most prevalent. And you see things, for example, like soldiers who change their name from Patrick because they don't want to be called Paddy by English and Americans when they're working in the army. This is in 1850s and 1860s America, that Paddy was a slur and they didn't want to be called it. So they go in under an alias to avoid it. But it was mitigated. You came up against an awful lot of people who didn't like working class. They didn't like immigrants. Many of you would probably know Henry Livermore Abbott, one of the great letter writers, correspondents of the American Civil War. The Harvard Regiment, 28 Massachusetts, nearly 1 in 4 of that regiment was Irish American. And Livermore hated immigrants. and he hated the working class. And he said it consistently. You can see some up there of the quotes that he wrote about what he thought about these groups. But Livermore also, when his men, and I'm speaking here specifically in reference to their experience in the street fighting in Fredericksburg, just before, if you like, the kind of main famous Marie's Heights battle on the 11th, the 20th Massachusetts, in the street fighting there, he loses a number of his Irish soldiers. And he writes these really heartfelt letters to the family of these men. And you can see how he might not like immigrants, he might not like working class, but the esprit de corps that had built up in that regiment mitigated a lot of that for him. That the kind of bond that they shared mitigated it. And I think that's the most common experience that a lot of Irish Americans have when they come up against that prejudice. It is kind of this level, particularly if they're early war volunteers. All right. I can't go into it now because we would be here all evening, but one of the other big elements, of course, is the Irish could give it out as well as take it. And one of the big, I suppose, most important elements when you're discussing the Irish Americans is looking at their attitudes towards race, right, and African Americans. So many of you would be familiar with the New York City draft riots, for example, in 1863. The Irish Americans dominated the draft riots, which saw things like African Americans in New York being attacked. The correspondence shows that Irish Americans were racist. I explain it. I'm happy to answer in questions as well. I think there's a fairly set number of reasons for why that was the case. You will hear it argued, for example, that they were trying to become white, the Irish, because they were so poor and downtrodden. But when you look at their correspondence, it's very clear that that is not the case at all. They see themselves as very white and superior, particularly to enslaved African Americans, right? And they express that quite literally in their correspondence. But it's very important to note the Emancipation Proclamation does not see the Irish leave the military in droves. In fact, you can argue the opposite is true. There hasn't been enough work. It's getting a bit better now. Not enough work done on late war volunteers and substitutes. But the evidence we have shows that the Irish were proportionately more willing to join the military in 1864 and 1865 than a native-born white American was, because of the financial inducements on offer were life-changing for them. Okay, I will just mention St. Patrick's Day because I'm going to spend the last 3 or 4 minutes here just talking about why so many of them enlist. So I will just actually go back to the previous slide for a second. This is one of my favorite quotes from it. I told you at the start, 250,000 of these guys are enlisted in the army, but they don't like African Americans. They don't like Abraham Lincoln. They don't like the Republican Party. They're really, really strong, committed Democrats throughout the war. This is my favorite quote of this. Will some other unknown, broken down old lawyer take Lincoln's place in 1864? Like, they stay McClellan men largely in the presidential election of 1864 when they're in service. So none of this ties in. Why are so many of them? Why are they overrepresented in this war? And to try and explain that, you have to start looking at identity. And we do know expressions of identity like this that happened on this day in 1863, the famous St. Patrick's Day celebrations in the Army of the Potomac. This was effectively a public relations blitz by the Irish Brigade in 1863, right? We are the unit that is flying the flag for Irish people in this in this army, in the Army of the Potomac. This is us celebrating our day. We have all the generals coming in. We are showing you what the Irish are doing for this war. And you might think, oh, well, they must have always been talking about St. Patrick's Day and things like this. But when you go outside of the ethnic Irish units that all celebrated it with events because it was part of their unit identity, what I showed you earlier, that Barrington in Wexford is one of the only references you'll see to St. Patrick's Day in Irish American writings. In fact, across all their writing, What you will see far more is references to the 4th of July and to Thanksgiving and to American holidays. You'll read about them visiting sites relating to American independence, George Washington, all this sort of stuff. And what you're seeing in this is a fused identity that Irish Americans have. They don't see themselves anymore as just Irish. From almost immediately getting off the boat, most of them see themselves as now American and Irish. And you see it in the way they describe the people at home. They talk about how are the Wilmington boys doing? How are the Albany boys doing? How are the Rochester boys doing? They always mean the Wilmington Irish, Rochester Irish, and Albany Irish, but they're not talking about Ireland. They're talking about their Irish communities in the towns that they have developed a connection to. And that's really important. They have bought in to America. They don't become American during the Civil War. They're serving because they see themselves as American before it starts. Okay. And what most of these guys do, and you're seeing it in their correspondence, is they are trying to recreate their Irish communities from Ireland in America. They're sending huge amounts of money home to bring their community over to the United States. Here's Edmund Dwyer there writing to his father in County Limerick, where I'm from, telling him to come over, that he's the only one left there. So you're seeing all this, and you're also seeing this commitment, almost immediate, to America. This is a great country, this great republic. The Constitution that they talk about is enormously important to them. And so I will just kind of bring it to a close by saying, and you'll read it in the book, when you accept that they have that identity, not just Irish, that they are American and Irish, it makes things a bit clearer. But when you look for actual motivational reasons, and I go into it in significant detail in the book itself, there are two motivations that are way above all others. And the first of them is economics. I think we often forget that secession at the start of the war causes an enormous recession in the North that massively impacts the working classes. So like the leatherworking industry, shoemaking industry in Massachusetts is in the doldrums. Factories are closing down in New York and Philadelphia. And the Irish are one of the most impacted groups by that because they are working those jobs. So from the Battle of First Bull Run in 1861, there are men on that battlefield who are there, at least in part, for financial reasons. And that continues. But it's rarely singular. And so you will see patriotism often mingled with that. Guys might have been thinking, oh, I'd love to join up, but I'm trying to support my mother and I have a job. He loses his job. The decision is made for him. He goes because into the army because that is the best of both worlds. But patriotism is the other big one. And it's Peter Carmichael wrote about this in his brilliant book, The War for the Common Soldier. But they speak about patriotism in very matter of fact ways. It's like duty. There's none of this flowery language that you get from kind of the upper class writers of the Civil War. It is, I have to stay in the army until this is done. And so you're getting this kind of very understated form of patriotism and determination. And those two reasons combined are part of, along with their identity, of why we see so many of them in the military. Okay, so that was a kind of a flying trip through the book, but I will leave it at that. Thanks a million for listening.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Damian. That was fascinating. Melissa, I'm going to check with you and see if we have any questions in the queue.
Yeah, we've got a lot of people on, and we actually have some discussion going on back and forth between some people who might have some relatives related to each other, which is kind of cool.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and Byron Davidson has commented several times that you had written an article about his two times great grandfather in the 33rd Massachusetts, and he thought it was really great. We have one question here too. What role did the Catholic Church or the parish networks play in recruitment and support for Irish soldiers?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So they played a fairly strong role in relation to it. I mean, some of it was kind of standoff. For example, quite famously, just as a bit of an aside, the first chaplain of the '69 New York State Militia got sent back by Bishop Hughes in New York because he had blessed some of the artillery before they were going to go into action, and he got recalled. But
Oh, wow.
the whole system. And I suppose really the most important thing they did was the parish system, because they identify by their parish, and you can see the degree to which the Catholic Church had imprinted that on them. There's a thing, I won't get into the details on it, called the devotional revolution that occurs in the years before it. But they identify with their parish very strongly, and with their church, right? And so you have kind of differing degrees of, if you like, the Catholic hierarchy's position before the war happens. You know, a lot of them wouldn't be anti-slavery, for example. Like they regarded, the Catholic Church in America generally regarded that people were better off in slavery in America than in savagery in Africa. That was kind of the view that was espoused largely. You don't get a massive amount of like preaching to enlist from the pulpit, like, but you do get a lot of eulogies for people who were killed. So, for example, the Irish Brigade have a very famous Requiem Mass after Fredericksburg and things. You do get some chaplains sent out, but again, not massive numbers. That for Notre Dame and places like that send people out. Guys go out from New York and that. So there is a kind of a constant support, rather than it wouldn't have been a massive drive in to try and help the numbers go into the military, if that makes sense. But it's very significant in relation to the identity and the experience that these guys have of their home communities.
Interesting. So we have another question, which is good, and you definitely address this in your book too, talking about the difference between how many Irish are actually in for the Union and how many are in for the Confederates. What does your research show about that pretty large difference in number?
Yeah, and you quite often hear, I mean, you'll see it a lot, like that there's lots on both sides. So there are proportionately a lot of Irish in the Confederacy based on the numbers of people who live there. So David Gleason, and if anybody wants to read about this, The Green and the Grey is the best book on the Irish and the Confederate States. About 20,000 Irish-born men served the Confederacy. So it's a 9-to-1 disparity. So like that's not in any way close. Like it's an enormous disparity. And they actually serve in high proportionate numbers in the South. It's just there isn't a massive Irish community there. Like it's New Orleans is the main one. So most Irish are in Louisiana units. And then you're talking about like the Charleston and Savannahs, Richmonds. So it's again the urban centers. And so it's just so dwarfed by what's going on in the North that there's almost no comparison to be made between them, even though it is a significant contribution to the Confederate military in and of itself. So, but it is about 9-to-1 difference.
Interesting. We also have somebody who's asking about how many of the Irish soldiers or Irish American soldiers spoke Gaelic as their primary language, and how many spoke English.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually written a bit about this because it's so difficult to get at. So plenty of them were native Irish speakers, right? The degree to which guys couldn't speak anything, only Gaelic Irish, is almost unknowable. Some of the recent immigrants may well have been in that scenario. The 88th New York that serve with the Irish Brigades are named for actually a famous British Army regiment, the 88th Connaught Rangers. That's where they wanted that number because of that. And a lot of them come from the west of Ireland. And one of the officers in that unit said that there was a lot of Irish speakers in the 88th New York. You come across it referenced very occasionally in things like widows' pension files, where a guy will have one name to his family, and then I have a guy who's called Fergal, and his name in English when he's in America is Frank. And so the Bureau of Pensions, of course, say this isn't the same person, and so they have to explain, oh, actually he was an Irish speaker. But they were bilingual, right? So, but large numbers of these people were, because of where the immigration comes from. So like the West, a lot of the Munster immigrants would have been able to speak Irish as well, places from West Cork and everything. But what you see very clearly is that they embrace English almost immediately. So they might have spoken it in their home. Um, they would have made sure that I'd say that their kids were speaking English. I have never, in all of the letters I have looked at, written by these enlisted men, seen one word that implies any Irish in it. Because, of course, Irish was never really written, you wrote in English. And so you can see them embracing English straight away. So it's kind of almost unknowable to get at that to how many, but they would have been speaking. There were guys who would have spoken to each other on battlefields in Irish and things who were familiar with that. Um, like undoubtedly, thousands of them had the capacity to speak fluent Irish.
Neat. This is kind of a two-part question from two different people, actually, who are kind of asking about the post-war experience of some of these men, particularly what you're talking about with the economic incentive for them to join up. So, how many Irish American soldiers do you find that actually participated in these veteran group, the GAR? And when they did participate in those groups, reinterpret their reasons for enlisting as not just economic but also patriotic, or how did they represent that service?
It's a marvelous question, because one of the biggest areas that needs work is Irish immigrant participation in the GAR. I tried to start looking at that, and have not got a huge amount, because, like, anecdotally, it's kind of said that maybe they weren't that involved with the GAR, that it was different. They were different groups, and I don't know how much kind of ordinary working class urban lads who are laboring all the time are necessarily getting involved in it. Some of them definitely do, though. I mean, you do come across guys in it. Again, you have to try and unpick from the officers. Like, a lot of the officers do fairly well out of it, the Irish officers who are kind of in a different class bracket. There is reinterpretation goes on. Yeah, the way there is in the wider war, I think. And the main level of reinterpretation is we fought for African American freedom, right? So you do see that. Like, it maybe takes a bit longer than a lot of others.
Yeah.
But they do certainly by the early 20th century, you're seeing that. One of the main markers that the Irish use it for, particularly amongst themselves, is they use their Civil War service as a community to differentiate themselves from the later 19th century waves of immigrants that come in. So, for example, the Italians and, say, Eastern Europeans who come in the later decades. It is only the Irish and the Germans who can turn around and go, we helped save the country, and so the Irish are big on doing that, and they consistently do that. It's one of the reasons, in fact, that we remember things like the Irish Brigade so well today, because they made sure we did. And it was a consistent message that they were giving out in the decades after the war. And often they were linking it with things like Irish freedom as well, the Irish Brigade were. But this is a consistent hammering home the reminder. We were on the fields at Gettysburg. And that, of course, was why the Irish Brigade really was formed in the first place. It was, and so that was driven through in memory afterwards. So it's significantly, I think, improved. I reference it in the book, actually. Four US presidents have spoken in front of the Irish Parliament, and three of them have specifically referenced Irish service in the United States military in the Civil War. So you can see the degree to which it worked for them, so yeah.
Interesting. Do you think that it then changes sort of the societal perception of them? So you talked a lot about the discrimination that they faced. Does their participation in this war really start to bleed into regular civilian society too?
No, not really. Susanna Urel did great work at this. She's written a great book on the Irish in the war as well, and she looks after at the period after, like, does their service get them
Yeah.
to where they want to be? And
Mhm.
it doesn't, for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
The 1863 draft riots are a massive problem,
Yeah.
even though most
Right.
Irish New Yorkers didn't participate in them. But they're also incredibly loyal Democrats. And when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, the Democrats are, even if you were a war Democrat, which a lot of all these Irish guys in the military were largely, you were effectively seen as a traitor. And so they had this kind of list of things against them. They were anti-abolitionists. They had a whole list of things against them that kind of as in the years afterwards, things didn't materially improve. They did eventually, and again, that's where things like the Irish Brigade come in. You know, they move on and they move up. But you know, Matt Gallman has written a great book, and it looks at things like the shoddy aristocracy, the idea that these Irish people were making these kind of cheap products to try and profiteer out of the war and stuff. There was a lot of that going on. And you're still seeing Thomas Nast, the great cartoonist, portraying the Irish in this kind of apish form into the 1870s and things. So ultimately it does, but there is no immediate reward for the community from service.
Interesting. We have somebody too yeah, that is, yeah. We have somebody too who's kind of got a sort of similar question on the opposite end, that they had seen an example of somebody who lied about where they came from or their city of origin, whether they were born in the United States or born in Ireland, when they enlisted in the army, because of, again, some of that discrimination against the Irish. Do you see that that's often the case too?
This is a massive thing, right? This fascinates me probably too much that you're going to be sorry that this question was asked, I think. But so there's a couple of things going on here, right? So it's very interesting when you start when I was trying to reconstruct numbers of Irish in the military, the US military, and I think Massachusetts actually are almost certainly guilty of this, I think are trying to suppress the number of immigrants in the Northern military, because you come across the military records, like it's an incredible how much it happens, where on their military records, it will say they are American born and they're Irish born. You go back to the census. Sometimes like they only emigrated in 1860 or 1861. They were adults and they're being recorded as American born. It is so widespread that to me, there has to be something going on in you know, I'm not talking about something wide scale and nefarious, but there is a kind of a local attempt to go, listen, we're just putting these guys down as American. Later in the war, when guys enlist as substitutes, the administration actually admits that that they are tending to record guys from where they are being credited to rather than where they're born, right? So that's one of the things. So you just can't trust what a military record says. But you do see, no question, altered nativity by Irish guys as well. And it seems to be in scenarios where if they have been in the United States, this is the most common, where they've been in the United States long enough that their accent might pass for American. And it's difficult to get at why this is, but the most obvious scenario is that it of course is better for you. And I write about a couple of examples. Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer, Civil War photographer, is one. Yeah. Sheridan is another, right? Big question marks over where they're from, but it was in neither of those guys' interests to say, oh yeah, I was born in Ireland. Like that serves you no good in the United States in the 19th century. So if you had the option in certain scenarios to say, oh no, I was born in New York or whatever, you would probably do it, right? And so I found a couple the other way, but that you do get this. And it makes perfect sense because you can lessen the discrimination that you might face.
Yeah, interesting. Speaking of accents, we have a lot of comments about yours and how great it is. So that discrimination does not exist anymore. There's a lot of people who are loving your accent.
It's better days these days,
yeah. Many people have commented on it. So we also have a comment or a question about if you know of any instances at, for example, Marie's Heights, whether there were Confederates and Union soldiers that were Irish Americans that fought against each other.
Yeah, so the Marie's Heights one is a bit of a myth, right? In terms of it's often said that the 24th Georgia, the Confederates are like an Irish regiment, and they're not. But it happened all the time. It happens at Blackburn's Ford before the first Battle of Bull Run. There are Irish guys from Richmond firing into, again, remember what I said at the start, urban northern units are filled with Irish Americans. So if you have a Confederate Irish, you know, we know where the Confederate Irish were kind of spread around. So for example, at Blackburn's Ford in 1861, you have Richmond Irish there. They're shooting at Irish American New Yorkers across the water. So it happens all the time. You do have, so the people just tend to be looking for kind of ethnic Irish regiments shooting at each other. So that doesn't happen as much. Perryville, it probably happens where you've got like almost a Confederate Irish regiment, but there's not a battlefield where a Confederate Irish unit is going into action. If they're fighting anybody from any urban area, they're shooting into other Irish people. So it's a constant of the war, and that's the way we should look at it. I think is the actual reality
Yeah.
of the way they were facing off against each other.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get that misconception from the movie Gods and Generals, that scene in there.
Yeah, yeah, and there were some Irish behind the wall. It's just a small number. It's nothing like a regiment, and there's no, there is a kind of there's a scene where they were, one of the lads is crying, shooting him, like where we do have commentary of either side relating to it. There's very little that suggests that, there were tears being shed over it. I mean, they mightn't have been thrilled about it, but they were going, "Why are you fighting for them? What are you doing fighting?" That's usually what those are, what they're saying.
Right.
In those sort of circumstances.
Interesting. Well, Tracy, I'll let you ask a couple questions because I know Tracy had a couple prepared here. So
Okay, sure. I had a question about basically in order to get a more widespread picture of Irish Americans in the Civil War, was there one fact that you found that surprised you the most when you were undertaking this research?
Yeah, I suppose the numbers is one of them. I got asked this a couple of times, and I'm never really prepared for it because so much of it is kind of surprising. I suppose the kind of scale and breadth of their service is one of the things that really has been hitting me over the head. Like, and anytime I look at it, and I'm looking at it again now with Antietam the way I did with Gettysburg, like it's frightening the degree to which you could give tours of all these battlefields where you're just talking about Irish guys. So you don't see that with the Germans. The Germans are much more concentrated in units. The Irish are everywhere. That's one. I suppose the other, though, is maybe the clarity that you get from the correspondence in relation to why they're serving. Like the two, when I started looking at them, I thought, oh, this is going to be really difficult to kind of pick apart. And it's not, it's not true for all of them. There's a guy in there who enlists because he was serving 25 years for murder. And they said, "Oh, do you want to enlist in the army and get out of jail?" And he went, "Oh, okay." So, you get everybody in there. But it is the economics, the economics and the patriotism, the degree to which you see that is staggering. And the marginal nature of their lives, like that's so apparent because of what they're talking about all the time, about the worries of people at home. Like it's really enormous. That kind of how the realities of life just trump what we think when we think about ideology in the Civil War and why people fight. For a lot of these working class people, and we don't know enough about working class urban soldiers in the Civil War, which make up the backbone of the Army of the Potomac, for example. We don't know enough about them beyond the Irish. Like these people are really living quite marginal lives a lot of the time. And so, serving in a war is a really big deal for them.
Right, for sure. Sort of following up on that, of all of the soldiers, the individual soldiers that you came across, was there one in particular that stood out to you?
Oh yeah, there's always a few. There's one I often tell when I'm talking about it. It's probably the most emotive. It's a guy called Hayes. He was in one of the Rochester regiments out in New York, and it was the experience he had, and again, it kind of related to economics. So he was serving at the front. He's in the 105th New York. He was serving at the front, and he hadn't got paid, and his wife at home in Rochester, also Irish, was pregnant, and had no accommodation. Couldn't keep the accommodation up because they couldn't pay the rent. And so the only reason she wasn't thrown out in the street is because an aunt of hers, the Irish all live in these little communities. An aunt of hers gives her some money so she can get these kind of smaller, danker accommodations. And she gives birth to twins.
Ooh.
And anyway, Hayes is at the front, knows nothing about this, had apparently only enlisted because he couldn't get work anyway, and was in the army, and he gets a letter to tell him that his wife had died in childbirth, and in the same letter telling him that all his surviving children had been sent to different orphanage asylums in Rochester while
Oh,
he's at the
wow.
front. And like, if you were to read a book and it went desertion, cowards, you go, oh, hang on a minute. But he actually didn't desert. He didn't desert. He didn't go home at that point. But like that's that is horrific.
Yeah.
It's horrific. Um, Ironically enough, he did desert later on in the war, but he didn't desert at that juncture. But it just like a story like that tells you a lot about things like desertion, doesn't it? Because I think you just can't know that type of story for most of these men because it's not going to be preserved, but it is for him. And I always thought that one was just thinking about him in camp, and you get a couple of those like that where guys are about to go into action for the first time and they're getting these sorts of letters, it's
Yeah.
horrific.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Tragic, yes.
Yeah. We're coming up on the hour, but I wanted to also mention your Andersonville Irish project and maybe a digital project. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, that's a big one at the moment that we're doing. We're trying to. It's quite similar to this project, I suppose, in the way of I was trying to get a group of men to look at Irish correspondence for. But I wanted to look at Andersonville in relation to it's the deadliest place of the Civil War. More people died there than anywhere else. And so we started a project a few years ago to try and identify Irish Americans who died there. And we're currently closing in on 1,100 Irish Americans in Andersonville National Cemetery. The vast majority of them Irish born because it's difficult to prove if somebody born in America, say, had Irish parents. And so, yeah, we've been doing that for a few years. We had a memorial place down there. If anybody visits Andersonville, you can see the memorial to the Irish. But that's telling us an awful lot about Irish service, particularly late in the war. Again, the units that are most represented by dead at Andersonville are not Irish ethnic units. It's like heavy artillery units, and the 16th Connecticut Infantry have a load of guys in there. So we're collecting their pensions, we're collecting their military service records. So we're seeing things like why they're enlisting. We're seeing the impact that their deaths have. Because we're doing it so systematically, we're getting a lot more Irish who don't have classic Irish surnames. So a lot of people from Dublin, for example, don't have, they're not called Murphy or Moriarty. A lot of people from Dublin, they might have names that could be English or American. We're finding a lot of them. We're finding a lot of Ulster Presbyterians in there. So it's telling us this incredible amount of detail about service and about the impact of the war and about where people are in it. And one of the guys there, we got a young fella who dies of starvation in Anderson prison, had watched his father die of the same thing on a public works scheme in West Clare during the Irish famine. It's so again, you have that duality with some of the Irish experience. If you'd been in the West and then you end up in Andersonville, I mean, it's there's not too many parallels, at least for white Northern servicemen, that you could have had that sort of experience, the doubling up of that sort of thing. So yeah, if people check out the Andersonville Irish Project page, it's on the IrishAmericanCivilWar.com website, and hopefully we're looking to try and get a partnership at the moment with an institution to try and have all of the images. Jackie Bedell, my colleague, and I have been working on all of this. So we want to make all of these images of their military service records and everything available to people. That's the plan.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
that is.
great undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple other questions, and we have some people who are commenting also, again, about stories that they've read of yours. So I encourage you to go look at the comments afterwards because they're very gracious and complimentary,
thanks, everyone.
of course, because you've told a lot of stories that are really touching people, and they've also complimented your presentation tonight as well. So we have a question about how many of these Irish American soldiers returned to Ireland after the war.
Oh, a very, very, very few. Very few indeed. I can plug another of my digital projects now in a minute. Sure, it'll just be endless plugs. But anyway, the Irish have one of the lowest immigrant return rates in Europe. In fact, generally, it's regarded as the lowest. So it's quite interesting because all of our music and everything is all about, oh, I wish I was at home, and forced out of home and everything. but the Irish do not return and they do not want to return. So it's like enormously low numbers. And it's one of the reasons the American Civil War gets very little attention in Ireland today, because so few people have a direct link, through family.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a story map actually, that looks at American pensions being paid out in Ireland. So I've mapped currently about 740 from the 19th century. There's probably a couple of thousand of them, but it's very low. Like it's astonishingly low in the great scheme of things when you have a
Wow.
250,000 service people. So their lives are in America. They wanted the people at home to come out to the States. At best, they might want to go home for a visit. And so that was that. That's they were committed to the United States.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's neat. Well, we are at the top of the hour. It's 8 o'clock, so I will let Tracy wrap it up here. But thank you.
Okay, well, I mean, I could go on for another hour. This is fascinating
Sorry, I'm
stuff.
going to interject. We do have a couple questions about buying the book and whether they can get it online. And I just wanted to let people know that you can purchase it online in our online store, and I will drop the link to that in our comments and put it in the top of the description of this event as well, so that you can easily access the online link to purchase the book.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Yeah, we try to keep all of the books from our Meet the Author events available in our online store in a separate section there. So definitely check it out. It's an amazing book. So thank you again, Damian, for a fascinating topic and a really terrific presentation for this St. Patrick's Day. Perfect timing. And I do want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in and asking excellent questions. Now, the next Meet the Author event will be on May 12th, and we will be talking to Diane Miller Somerville, and her book is Aberration of Mind, Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War Era South. So that sounds like a fascinating topic. I encourage you to tune in May for that. And thank you all again for tuning in. And please, if you're ever Damian in Frederick, Maryland, come
Yeah.
by and visit our museum, National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We'd be happy to give you a personal tour.
I definitely will. Thanks so much, Tracy.